I think this history of Jewish anti-Zionism is so important to look at other models of the fight against anti-Semitism and other models of Jewish self-emancipation that have existed throughout history. This model of, some Jewish authors referred to it as a fight for red assimilation, that the way that Jews were finally going to be accepted in society, bourgeois society ultimately always denied Jewish people equal rights and complete acceptance. And red assimilation, the idea was that by toppling bourgeois society, by getting rid of the capitalist mode of production, Jews could finally maintain whatever identities they wanted while becoming full members, equal members of a socialist society.
Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. My name is Oden. In our last episode, I spoke to Mariam Alaniz about Israel's current siege on Gaza, including the context leading up to the war on the Palestinian people and what leftists should fight for in the struggle for Palestinian liberation. You should definitely check that episode out if you haven't already. In today's episode, we are looking through a historical lens. We're going to explore the history of socialist anti-Zionist Jews. Israel's war against Palestine is often seen as eternal. People present it as if it's this sort of ancient, intractable battle of religions between Jews and Muslims. And many people will also claim that all Jews are Zionists and that Zionism has always existed, and therefore anyone who opposes Israel must be anti-Semitic. But this isn't true. For one, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. Also, Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived in relative peace in Palestine for centuries. It was only in the age of imperialism, and especially with the beginning of Zionist colonization in the late 1800s, that this so-called eternal conflict began. In fact, there have always been anti-Zionists in the Jewish diaspora and in Israel who've joined in struggle with Palestinians for peaceful coexistence. To discuss this today, I'm joined by Nathaniel Flakin, who recently wrote an article for Left Voice titled A Brief History of Anti-Zionist Jews. Nathaniel is a historian in Berlin who writes for Left Voice and for our German sister site, Klasse gegen Klasse. In addition to taking us on a fascinating tour of the earliest anti-Zionist Jewish socialist groups up to the present day, Nathaniel explains the key historical context surrounding the rise of Zionism, including the age of nationalism, imperialism, and colonialism. We also discuss why socialism, which is international and fights for the dissolution of rigid national and ethnic groups, is incompatible with Zionism's aim of building an ethno-state. This is why, as Nathaniel explains, socialists have always been on the front lines of the fight against anti-Semitism. Finally, we explore the key lessons we can draw from the early socialist anti-Zionist Jews. As Nathaniel explains, and as Mariam Alaniz explained in our last episode, the solution to this conflict is to fight for a single secular socialist Palestine on its historic territory with democratic rights for all its inhabitants. In addition to writing for Left Voice, Nathaniel has published a biography of the Jewish Trotskyist resistance fighter Martin Monat, and he's published the anti-capitalist guidebook Revolutionary Berlin. Both of these are available from Pluto Press, and I will be linking to them in the show notes. And I will also link to his column in the German publication ND. Finally, you can support the show at patreon.com/leftvoice and find us on social media, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok as @left_voice. And one more thing. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Here's my interview with Nathaniel. Nathaniel, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So the focus of our conversation today obviously is anti-Zionism, but I think that a logical starting point would be to discuss Zionism itself so that we can kind of situate ourselves in this history. So my first question is kind of a basic one, which is, when did Zionism start?
Well, today Zionism is presented as more or less the same as Judaism. There's this historical myth that the temple was destroyed by the Romans and Jews were driven out into the diaspora. And ever since then, all Jews have wanted to return to Jerusalem. But Zionism is actually a very modern movement. So the book by Theodor Herzl, The Jewish State, that was only published in 1896. You could say maybe a few decades earlier, you'd had the first discussions about the creation of a Jewish nation state. Um, probably, probably the first person to really talk about this was Moses Hess, who published a book in 1860. And Moses Hess was a contemporary of Karl Marx. They had been comrades fighting side by side in the Revolution of 1848. So, I mean, you could say that with Karl Marx and Moses Hess existing around the same time, you could say that Jewish socialist anti-Zionism is about as old as Zionism itself is. Zionism is really a product of the modern bourgeois era. It's people like to project these nation states that we live in backwards into eternity. People will talk about, oh, Germans 2,000 years ago, and it's really easy to forget that nation states, the idea that everyone has a nationality and that all the people living in a territory have the same national identity. This is something that's only existed for 150, maybe 200 years, slowly implemented with great deal of violence over the course of the 19th and 20th century. And so it's in the course of this that you have the rise of modern anti-Semitism, this idea that Jews don't belong to the nation. They have these divided identities. They're not trustworthy. And in response to anti Semitism, you have different attempts at answers by Jewish people. And one answer is socialism, that we need a transformation of social relations in order to assure equality for all people. And the other, the more bourgeois, the more conservative response to that is to say the solution to Jews not quite being accepted in nation states is that then we should create a separate Jewish nation state. In a sense, if you read Herzl's book, and I wonder how many supporters of Zionism today have actually looked at Herzl, because on the one hand, you have a lot of people denying that Israel is a colonial project. And I always think, well, just look at the source documents like Herzl made. No secret that this is a colonial project like any other modern settlement project. And he was very explicit about asking for the support of imperialist powers, just like they were supporting colonialism in other parts of the world. So Herzl actually took over a number of anti-Semitic arguments. In his diaries, he talked about the uselessness of attempting to fight against anti-Semitism, for example. He saw it as something eternal and as something that was unchangeable. And yeah, ultimately, this idea of anti-Semitism as something eternal, there's no way to explain that without having a fairly low opinion of Jewish people. So the modern Zionist movement starts in the 1890s, early 1900s. And at the same time, you can see the first explicitly Jewish socialist group. So the first group that works in Yiddish is founded in London among Jewish workers in the East End in 1876. So we're talking a few decades before modern Zionism exists. Oh, and the other important thing to understand about Zionism is it's very closely connected to the development of modern European colonialism. At the end of the 19th century, you have the establishment of European colonies. And this, you'd had thinkers beforehand. I mean, even going back into the late Middle Ages, there's reports of rabbis talking about Jewish immigration to Palestine. But the logistical conditions for actually making this happen, for making it possible to settle hundreds of thousands or even millions of people into the Middle East, that really only becomes available with European colonialism. So Zionism is always very connected to that. I was reading a book just recently about debates about Zionism inside the workers' movement, and I thought it was really interesting. There was fairly early a section of the workers' movement in the Second International in the early 1900s that came out in favor of Zionism, and this was mostly concentrated in the right wing of the Labour Party in the UK, for example. And these were the exact same figures that were really enthusiastic about other colonial projects as well. For them as well, Zionism was just another example of white settler colonialism that needed to be supported in their vision to have a civilizing imperialist mission in the Middle East, in Africa.
I think what you just described in terms of the historical context in which Zionism arose is super interesting and worth dwelling on for just a moment. So I want to kind of try to say this back to you to see if I'm understanding it correctly. So Zionism is a product of the modern bourgeois era in which there's this idea that everyone has a nationality And these nation states that people are part of, they were, as you said, projected into the past as if they were pretty much eternal. These states had existed forever. So, this idea of like Germany has always existed, France has always existed. There is such a thing as like being of German nationality. But in reality, as we all know, these nation states were created very violently over the past 150 to 200 years. And so, if I'm understanding you correctly, the solution to anti Semitism during this era to Jews not being accepted into nation states, to put it a bit simplistically, was to create and work toward a separate Jewish nation. This was the more, as you put it, the more conservative answer to anti Semitism rather than what socialists would argue. And in the same vein, we have to see Zionism in the context of and as connected to the European settler colonialist projects, these so called civilizing imperialist missions where you can also settle a nation into a place, like you could go and settle Palestine. And this colonialist era also had the logistical conditions for being able to do this.
Yeah, and the British Empire thought a lot about this as well. So they had already, when they conquered Ireland, had put Protestant settlers among the Catholic people of Ireland in order to better exercise control. Not only relying on soldiers, but have people who are established there, but who are isolated, who are totally dependent on the empire. And, we see hundreds of years later, even, who remain quite loyal to this colonial project. And the British Empire was very explicit about being able to use Jewish colonists in Palestine for the same purpose, as a way to control the Middle East by having this dependent, loyal population there. That's why I think it's important to understand that the idea of creating a Jewish homeland in Palestine, from the perspective of the imperialists, was never about protecting Jewish lives or supporting Jewish aspirations to their own nation state. It was always about imperial control. It was about using Jews as cannon fodder for these colonial and imperialist projects.
I want to dig a bit deeper into something you said about how Jewish socialist anti Zionism is, in some ways, as old as Zionism itself. I think this is a really good point to start at the sort of beginning of our chronology. Could you talk about who the earliest Jewish socialist anti Zionist groups were and why they were anti Zionists?
So the biggest anti-Zionist group, well, really the biggest Jewish socialist group I think that's ever existed, was the General Jewish Labor Bund in Lithuania, Poland, and Russia. So this is referring to, I guess today we'd say, Eastern Europe. This was the western part of the Tsarist Empire. These are all countries that were controlled by Russian Tsarism, and there you had millions and millions of Jews. Often, they were forced to live in specific territories by Tsarism, a terribly anti-Semitic state, and there were often communities that were entirely dominated by Jewish people with their own culture and languages, where Yiddish was the main language. And so, as these Jewish workers started to get organized, they were debating about strategy. What was their goal? How did they envision a world without the oppression they suffered from? And in contrast to Zionism, the term that the Bund, that's the short name we used to refer to it, the Bund. The term that they used was in Yiddish, and apologies to my Yiddish-speaking friends for my terrible pronunciation, but the term they used is Doigkeit, which is something like here-ness. That the world they were looking for was not something far away that they would have to leave behind the lives they knew to go create a new society somewhere else, but they wanted to focus on what was Doi, what was here, and changing the situation where they were. And that also meant fighting alongside workers of other nationalities to end the oppression. And so there's one famous Bundist song about the Zionists. The title of the song, in English translation, it says, "Oh, you foolish Zionists." And what they sing is, you want to take us to Jerusalem so that we can all die together as a nation, but we'd rather stay here in Russia and fight for liberation. I think that sums up the debate really well.
So, would you say that Jewish workers were divided between Zionists and anti Zionists?
I mean, looking back, that's often the way it appears to us. That you've got these two big blocks, but in reality, I think there was never such a clear line. Like there was all kinds of different tendencies in between. And this is usually summarized with the term of socialist Zionism. So besides Theodor Herzl, Theodor Herzl was an assimilated Austrian Jew. He was a journalist and an author. I think he wrote plays, and he was quite conservative. He wasn't a big Democrat. He believed in what he called an aristocratic republic. You wanted some democracy, but you wanted to make sure that better people were in charge of it. He also ran his Zionist movement in an incredibly authoritarian way. And fairly early, just a couple of years after Herzl publishes his book, you have new ideas coming from working class Jewish thinkers that take up the ideas of Zionism and try to combine them with socialist ideas. The most influential is Ber Borokov, and he writes his program about 10 years after Herzl does. And he agrees with the idea of building a homeland for Jews in Palestine, except he thinks that this should be a socialist homeland. And today, another part of the Zionist myth is that when Jewish settlers arrived in Palestine, that it was more or less an empty territory, and they built an entire country out of nothing. But I mean, even if communication wasn't as good at the time, no one thought that Palestine was empty. And so Ber Borokov also thought about this: what's going to happen to the indigenous population when these socialist Jewish settlers arrive in Palestine? And he talked about, the fact that most of the inhabitants of Palestine were peasants, were also terribly oppressed by big landowners. And Borokov had a vision that these two groups of proletarians, of working people, could be united together by the class struggle. He wrote some contradictory things about this, but there's definitely within socialist Zionism this idea that you can have not just a Jewish homeland in Palestine, but some kind of binational Jewish and Arab workers' republic in Palestine. And the theory said that the Jews were in a special position in class society, that capitalism hadn't turned them into normal proletarians that had often forced Jewish workers in Eastern Europe into these very petty bourgeois modes of production, tiny workshops, where it was hard to organize a big modern labor movement. And so the idea was kind of that by creating a Jewish nation state in Palestine, that would enable the development of a massive Jewish proletariat, and that would be the necessary social subject to create then a Jewish socialism. I discovered from 1906 the biggest Marxist journal in the world at the time was Die Neue Zeit, like the New Era, the Marxist theoretical journal published by Karl Kautsky in Berlin. And I discovered an essay by a socialist named Chaim Yaakov Gelfand, and he was debating with this idea of socialist Zionism. And he pointed out that a principle of socialism that all socialists at the time agreed to was that of class independence, was the rejection of class collaboration with the bourgeoisie. And Gelfand pointed out that Zionism is a project of the Jewish bourgeoisie. The Jewish bourgeoisie is financing this. There's no way to have a colonization of Palestine based on class independence. You can only do that via class collaboration, and you can only do that by winning support from the imperialist powers for this new colonial project. Interestingly, Gelfand also pointed out that this colonization project, despite what the socialist Zionists thought, that taking over land that's currently being used by Palestinian peasants, there's no way to form a happy socialist coexistence on the basis of first dispossessing the people that are there now. He said this is going to lead to new national conflicts and ultimately also to new anti-Semitism. This is something written in 1906. What is it, like 115 years ago? And I think, unfortunately, proven to be absolutely right. I was just thinking we can see if we need to see if we can get that article translated and published in English. That would be a really interesting, like extremely early socialist polemic against Zionism.
I think at this point, I think it's worth trying to be really clear about something which you've mentioned to already and kind of alluded throughout these historical instances, and something which is obviously like the undercurrent of the article you wrote on this topic, which is Zionism is incompatible with socialism. And a fundamental reason behind this is that Zionism is a project of class collaboration with the bourgeoisie. Am I getting that correct? Would that be the correct way of stating like why Zionist socialism is not possible, for example?
That actually makes me think of an anecdote. This is jumping a bit forward in our chronology, but I was thinking of an interview written by a German Jewish communists who arrived in Palestine in 1936. And, he went to one of the kibbutzim, one of these collective farms. And that was like the biggest symbol of socialist Zionism, that rather than creating a new country based on big landowners and landless peasants, they were going to create collective farms where everyone is equal, where all work is shared, where there's no private property, where everyone manages the farms together democratically. And so this emigrant to Palestine, he needs to flee from the Nazis. He arrives in Palestine, arrives at a kibbutz. Rudolf Segal is his name. And he talks about not long after arriving at the kibbutz, you have the first Arab uprising against Jewish colonization. And so he says, after that point, I'm quoting here, we could only go out to work on the fields with armed guards or carrying weapons ourselves. We surrounded the camp with fortified positions. After work, each of us had to stand guard for about 2 or 3 hours. Then we each held a hand grenade in our hand with a rifle standing nearby and waited for possible attacks. And for me, this is the problem with socialist Zionism in a nutshell. That you're trying to create this community based on equality and democracy and everybody working together for the common good. And simultaneously, you're holding a hand grenade there, seeing if one of the peasants who just a couple of years earlier had been on the same land is approaching and you're going to murder them. Yeah, socialism, despite what Stalin said, has always been an internationalist project. There's no way to build up an equal society on the basis of ethnic cleansing and chauvinist exclusion like this.
That's such an incredibly illustrative quote. So, you already described some of the earliest socialist anti Zionist groups, but in our sort of chronology here, we get to 1919, which is a notable year because that was when Palestine saw its first socialist party, the Socialist Workers' Party, which was founded by Jews. Could you speak a little bit more about the Socialist Workers' Party, what they were fighting for?
Yeah, so the original party had a name in Hebrew, and the abbreviation was MPS. And so the supporters of this party, Socialist Workers' Party, were known as the Mopsim, which is just a great name. Yeah, and so it was a party founded by Jewish workers who had come to Palestine. These are Jewish colonists in Palestine. And they had just heard about the Russian Revolution. And the Russian Revolution is the first time in history where you have a government where Jewish people play leading roles and a government that's fighting seriously against anti-Semitism, where anti-Semitism is something that's not tolerated and where the government is doing as much as possible to eliminate these prejudices. And specifically in the Russian Civil War, you have the white armies committing the most terrible atrocities. Hundreds of thousands of Jews murdered in these counter-revolutionary pogroms. And it's the Red Army. It's the Red Army who's led by Leon Trotsky, by a Jewish revolutionary that's protecting the Jewish people of the Soviet Union against these counter-revolutionary hordes. And so that has a huge effect on Jewish people all over the world. And many of them start to think that, as the Bund had said a few years earlier, too, that real liberation is going to be fighting alongside working people of all nationalities, wherever you are, and trying to transform social relations all around the world, and not just trying to escape into a safe haven in Palestine. So, the Socialist Workers' Party was founded by people who had been socialist Zionists, who had come to Palestine hoping to create a socialist homeland there, and recognizing there that it was a terrible contradiction. The biggest socialist Zionist organization internationally was called Poale Zion, was the Workers of Zion. And they had these two competing commitments. On the one hand, towards socialism, and on the other hand, towards the colonization of Palestine. And eventually, Poale Zion, only about a decade after it was founded, the only way to resolve these contradictions was to split. One side went in one direction, and the other side went in the other direction. So the right wing of Poale Zion became a reformist, bourgeois, a nationalist party. Today the Israeli Labor Party traces its roots back to the right wing of Poale Zion. So David Ben-Gurion, the founder of Israel, was a member of the right wing of Poale Zion. And the left wing, this is an international organization with members all over the world, wherever there's Jewish diasporic communities. And the left wing joins the communist movement. They all join the communist parties of whatever country they happen to be in. And so it's the supporters of the left wing of Poale Zion. I'm simplifying a bit, but it's the left wing of Poale Zion in Palestine that then becomes the Communist Party. And what I found really interesting as well, just linguistically, is that the first communist party in Palestine to have that name, the name was actually in Yiddish. So again, apologies to my Yiddish-speaking friends, but it was the Palästinische Kommunistische Partei, the PKP. And that's a very bold political statement that the Jewish workers founding this party, that they choose the language of the diaspora, Yiddish, and not the language of this yet to be created nation state, Hebrew. Yeah, and so this new party, the PKP, they were anti-Zionist. Their goal was class struggle against British colonialism. They wanted a Soviet Palestine. This is in 1919, 1920. You have a big revolutionary wave going all around the world, and there's a ton of optimism among workers in all continents that it's a matter of time before the entire world goes socialist. And so they wanted Palestine, both Arab and Jewish workers in Palestine, to be part of that.
Yeah, speaking of the PKP, I think this is a really good point to talk about Stalinism. So the PKP you were mentioning formed in 1923, but you also wrote in your article that it was ultimately destroyed by Stalinism. I mean, I think this is generally such an important topic. We recently did an interview with Doug Green on his book about Stalinism, and we discussed also the influence of Stalinism in the US context in our interview with historian Brian Palmer a while back. So I wanted to ask you on that topic, how did Stalinism end up destroying PKP?
So, like every Stalinized party, the Communist Party of Palestine was forced to carry out these terrible political zigzags and accompanying purges, throwing out everyone who was responsible for the previous line and now a new line, trying to get new people to carry that out. An additional difficulty faced by the PKP was around 1930 in the context of initial Arab uprisings against Jewish colonization, which was supported by the British Empire. Many of the prominent Jewish communists were expelled from Palestine. The British colonial authorities they wanted to encourage Jewish colonization, but at the same time wanted to keep out any communist influences. So a lot of prominent Palestinian Jewish communists were kicked out of their new country, and many of them ended up seeking refuge in the Soviet Union. So they're arriving in the first years of the 1930s, and just a couple of years later, 1936, 1937, you have the Great Purges. Most of the leaders of the PKP end up being murdered in the Stalinist Soviet Union. I just recently read the autobiography of one of them, Joseph Berger. He was one of the few to survive, and he survived just mostly by dumb luck, mostly by surviving for over 20 years in Stalinist prisons and gulags. Has no explanation himself why he wasn't murdered when so many of his comrades were. And his autobiography was really sad too. He almost wrote nothing about Palestine. He kind of starts his life story in the camps. It's mostly just a memoir of time in the camps and all the different people he came into contact with, mostly communists. He said that was always a big surprise. That historically the original prisons in the Soviet Union had been full of former aristocrats and white officers and counter-revolutionaries. And, he met just from different nationalities. He was of Polish nationality himself, and met communists from lots of different countries. One other leader of the PKP who survived and is a bit more famous, is Leopold Trepper, also originally from Poland, went to Palestine, joined the Communist Party, and he was in the Soviet Union for a time as well. But he escaped the worst of the purges because he went to Western Europe as an intelligence agent. And he's a real hero of the anti-fascist resistance. People should know the name Leopold Trepper. He led a spy network in Western Europe that was able to provide lots of accurate information to the Soviet Union about the upcoming German surprise attack. And again, the great tragedy of people like Leopold Trepper is that all his brave work was basically thrown away in the Stalinist Soviet Union. He described how, trying to get this information into the Soviet Union, and because of the purges, all of the intelligence officials he had been working with were all gone. The people who had put in their place had no idea who he was. And so all this accurate information he was providing was largely ignored. And the Stalinist leadership of the Soviet Union was totally surprised by the Nazi attack, despite having multiple networks of communist spies having warned them months earlier. Yeah, and Trepper's story is tragic as well, because after the war, He went to Poland, which had now been taken over by Stalinists, the new People's Republic of Poland. And there, the Stalinist regime in the 1960s, when they were confronted with student protests and political revolt calling for more democracy, they decided to channel away this anger at their government with a thinly disguised anti-Semitic campaign, saying we need to fight Zionist influences in Poland. And what happened is after 1968, thousands of Jewish communists were forced to leave Poland, including Leopold Trepper. So he actually, because of these terrible betrayals by different Stalinist regimes, he actually ended up in Israel. That's where he spent the last years of his life. And so, despite the fact that he had rejected Zionism for like 50 years, he was eventually forced back into Israel because he didn't have any alternatives. And I just wanted to quote Leopold Trepper briefly because he said something about the purges as well, these betrayals by Stalinism. Leopold Trepper, he wrote, "Who did protest against Stalinism? The Trotskyists can lay claim to this honor, following the example of their leader, who was rewarded for his obstinacy with the end of an ice axe. The Trotskyists fought Stalinism to the death, and they were the only ones who did. Let them not forget, however, that they had the enormous advantage over us of having a coherent political system capable of replacing Stalinism. They had something to cling to in the midst of their profound distress at seeing the revolution betrayed."
So, what groups emerged after the destruction of the PKP? And could you also speak to Stalin's role in supporting the creation of the State of Israel?
So, like everywhere else in the world, you had anti-Stalinist communists, people grouped around the left opposition, the most prominent of whom was Leon Trotsky, who organized in new communist organizations that tried to stick to the principles of the Russian Revolution, the principles of Lenin and the Communist International. In Palestine, the organization they created was called the Revolutionary Communist League, or RCL. This was a Trotskyist group. This was the Palestinian section of the Fourth International. And this was also made up mostly of Jewish workers. And different categories of Jewish workers, too. So you had some who had actually been born in Palestine, kind of the first generation of native born Jewish workers in Palestine. Others were refugees from Nazi Germany, refugees from fascism. And interestingly, some of them were people who had been socialist Zionists in Germany who had really wanted to go to Palestine. Others, people who had simply wanted to escape from the Nazis and couldn't get a visa for anywhere else. And via different ways, they recognized the terrible contradictions of Zionism. The quote I read before about trying to build up a collective farm while simultaneously having to guard against indigenous peasants that had been driven away. And so they got together in this Revolutionary Communist League. And interestingly, figures like Jakob Moneda was one of them, and he was trying to organize joint trade unions for Arab and Jewish workers to fight for better wages, because it was a terrible problem for both working classes that Palestinian workers made far less than Jewish ones did. And so both groups of workers were played against each other. Jewish workers were told they would need to accept wage cuts because Palestinians would work for so much cheaper. But Palestinians were told they would need to accept wage cuts because Jewish workers tended to be more qualified. And so people like Moneda, Trotskyists, were trying to overcome these national divisions, set up a joint trade union movement. And Moneda actually got imprisoned by the British colonial authorities for almost 2 years for being a communist. Yeah, interestingly too, the RCL was not a purely Jewish organization. In 1939, that's when you had the Hitler-Stalin Pact, which all around the world was perceived, correctly as a terrible betrayal of the anti-fascist struggle by Stalin. And so, a veteran Palestinian communist named Jabra Nicola, he had been the editor of the Arab language paper of the Communist Party in Palestine. He broke with Stalinism and joined the RCL. And even after that organization's collapse, Nicola remained a Trotskyist for the rest of his life. Now, after the Second World War, before the State of Israel is founded, a lot of the immigrants who had formed the RCL, a lot of them actually returned to Europe. They expect at the end of the Second World War, there's going to be a revolutionary wave, just like there had been at the beginning of the First World War, and they want to be in Europe where it takes place. That doesn't happen, as we know now, but a lot of these Jewish Palestinian Trotskyists remain really active as revolutionaries until the end of their lives. So the most famous one by far is definitely a guy born as Yigael Gluckstein. He went to first Ireland and then to London. He took on the pseudonym Tony Cliff and became kind of the founder and leader of the International Socialists and the Socialist Workers' Party in Great Britain. But there's also similar cases in West Germany. I mentioned Jakob Moneda. He went back to West Germany in 47 or 48. Also, Rudi Segal, the guy who was trying to protect the kibbutz against Palestinian infiltrators. He also went back to West Germany, and they became leading members of the International Marxist Group in West Germany. In Palestine itself, you had in 1948. You had the Nakba, you had the ethnic cleansing when the State of Israel was founded, and that was such an incredibly reactionary climate that the organization, the Revolutionary Communist League, largely collapsed. You had a number of activists who maintained their revolutionary convictions, but it took a while. It was only in a new situation where they could organize again. And you had asked me about Stalin before. So one of the biggest betrayals by Stalin internationally was the support he gave for the foundation of the State of Israel. Stalin is a well-known anti-Semite. As early as the 1920s, was using anti-Semitic arguments in order to fight against the opposition in the Communist Party. And the worst was in the early 1950s, after the Second World War. There was a terrible campaign of persecution against Jews in the Soviet Union. A lot of the organizers of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, people who had organized in the Soviet Union and internationally Jewish support for the war effort, a lot of them were executed at the end of the war. You had these terrible anti-Semitic show trials in Eastern Europe, the Slansky trial in Czechoslovakia, where prominent Jewish communists were persecuted with these, totally bizarre accusations. And a lot of anti-Semitic cliches as well, that these Jewish people, they're not loyal to the new socialist motherland. You can't entirely trust them. They're cosmopolitan. They're probably more loyal to the Israeli government, et cetera, et cetera. And Stalin supported the state of Israel because, it's ultimately hard to know. Stalin didn't confide in anyone, but it seems that he thought that there had been conflicts between Jewish colonists and the British colonial powers, up to and including Zionist militias bombing British installations. And it seems possible that Stalin, in his geopolitical naivete, thought that a Jewish state in Palestine would be an anti-imperialist force and that it would be kind of an ally of the Soviet Union. And so one famous fact about this is that Stalinist Soviet Union was among the first countries internationally to recognize the new state of Israel, far earlier than the United States, for example, did. But it's much worse than that, actually, because a lot of the weapons that the Haganah, that the Zionist militias were using to commit the Nakba, to carry out ethnic cleansing, had actually come from the Eastern Bloc, from the Stalinist bloc, via Czechoslovakia. And here we get to the Stalinized Communist Party. It was now known as the Maki, the Communist Party of Israel. And the Maki played an important role in transporting these arms to Palestine. So I think we can say that Israel in its current form wouldn't exist today without the support that Stalin gave it. I remember listening to a talk by a Turkish Trotskyist who was expressing his shock at this. How is it possible that there's a single Stalinist left in the Middle East? Stalin, among his many terrible crimes, helped create the State of Israel. How can anyone possibly ignore this? But it is an unfortunate fact that in Turkey and in a number of Middle Eastern countries, there remain people committed to Stalinism. One more thing I'd like to mention is this phenomenon of socialist Zionists in Palestine joining the Trotskyist movement. This is something that's not limited to Palestine. You see in the 1930s all over the world, socialist Zionists joining the Trotskyist movement because they recognize that Zionism doesn't offer a perspective to struggle against the immediate danger of fascism, and simultaneously Stalinism doesn't offer an alternative because Stalinism is pacting with imperialism, eventually even pacting with Nazi Germany, and simultaneously has given up the fight against anti-Semitism. So you have figures, the most famous one by far is definitely Abraham Leon, the former chair of the Zionist Student Federation in Belgium. He becomes a leading member of the Belgian section of the Fourth International, organizing underground resistance against the Nazis. And then, if I can plug my book for a second, I also wrote a biography of from Berlin, actually, a Jewish resistance fighter named Martin Monat, who he was in exile in Belgium, having fled from the Nazis, and joins the underground Trotskyist resistance there. His contribution to history is because he's a native German speaker, he takes on the responsibility for the fraternization work. So he is going to German occupation soldiers in France and organizing them in these anti-fascist, anti-Nazi soldiers committees. That's a really exciting example of this kind of internationalist class struggle perspective to fight against fascism, to fight against anti-Semitism that Trotskyism has always stood for and that Zionism didn't offer.
I think this brings us up to around kind of like the 1960s ish. And you write about how this was an era of the birth of, for example, Israel's New Left, including a group called Matzpen. Can you talk a little bit about this era in the history that we're discussing in this conversation?
Yeah, so with the foundation of the State of Israel, you had a very reactionary, chauvinistic climate. It's in the 1960s, all over the world, you have this ascent of class struggle, this youth rebellion. Already in 1962 in Israel, you have a split from the official Communist Party, and they call themselves the Israeli Socialist Organization, ISO, but they put out a magazine called Matzpen, which is the Hebrew word for compass, and that's the name that everyone knows them as, Matzpen. Matzpen is interesting because it combines different generations of leftists. So it started by leftists in the early 1960s. One of the founders of Matzpen, Moshe Machover, is actually still around, still a dedicated socialist. He lives in London now. He must be in his 80s now, but still writing really interesting analyses of Zionism and how to fight against it. Moshe Machover was also a former socialist Zionist. He had been Hashomer Hatzair, the young guard, before becoming a Trotskyist or a radical leftist. I guess it would be an exaggeration to call Matzpen a Trotskyist organization. It was a radical left organization with Trotskyists inside it. And yeah, it was combined with younger activists, politicized by the rebellion of 1967, 1968, which also took place in Israel. But there were also veteran Trotskyists who joined Matzpen. So I mentioned before Jabra Nikula, a Palestinian Trotskyist, and also a German Trotskyist named Jakob Taut. And Jakob Taut is unfortunately not very well known. I want to mention him briefly. If you read the book Revolutionary Yiddish Land, he's profiled there, a great book by French sociologists looking at revolutionary Yiddish-speaking traditions in different countries and how they kind of continued in Israel. Jakob Taut, he ended up in Palestine in 1934. He had been a communist before. He had been not a Trotskyist, but he had been a oppositional communist. He had actually been connected to the right opposition. And he ended up in Palestine not out of any sympathy for the Zionist project, but just because he couldn't get a visa to go anywhere else. He worked in Haifa at the oil refinery, and in the context of the Nakba, a Zionist militia placed a bomb at the oil refinery that blew up and killed half a dozen Arab workers there. And in response to this horrific mass murder, an angry crowd went through the refinery and was just slaughtering Jews they happened to run into. And Taut and some of his colleagues, they tried to barricade themselves in a room. The door got broken down, and almost all of them were killed. Taut kind of survived by a miracle, like literally underneath dead bodies of his colleagues. And what's so amazing is that Taut, he, despite this terrible trauma, stuck to his profound internationalist convictions. The idea that the only way forward for Jewish and Palestinian workers in Palestine was to fight together in a common class struggle against Zionism and imperialism. And so Taut, when he recovered from his injuries, he remained a communist, and he became kind of the, what do you call it? The gray eminence of Matzpen. Mostly a youth group, but a few older comrades. And yeah, Matzpen was always a tiny group. I mean, Israel is not a big country to begin with, but Matzpen, some people say never had more than 20 members. I think it's more realistic to say they probably had never had more than 50 members. And yet, because, especially in 1967, during the Six-Day War, when Israel conquered new Palestinian territories, brought millions of Palestinians under a new occupation regime, it was pretty much only Matzpen that was speaking out against this. And so everyone knew about them, up to the prime minister. Matzpen helped set up in the early 1970s the Black Panthers of Israel. This is a group of Mizrahim, so this is Jewish people of North African or Middle Eastern descent who still face discrimination in Israel. Israel isn't just self-proclaimed state of the Jews, but there's racial hierarchies among different Jewish populations in Israel. And so there was a Black Panthers group that was fighting for equality for these Mizrahim, and they were connected to the radical left around Matzpen. I found a quote from Matzpen that Moshe Machover brought up recently. This is a statement that they put out immediately after the Six-Day War, so right after Israel had first occupied the West Bank and Gaza. Matzpen wrote, "Occupation entails foreign rule. Foreign rule entails resistance. Resistance entails repression. Repression entails terror and counter-terror. Victims of terror are mostly innocent people. Holding on to the occupied territories will make us into a nation of murderers and murder victims." And it's haunting. It's terrible to think just how right they were, how clear this was at the time. And so Matzpen, they weren't super influential in Israel. Everyone knew them, but most people hated them. But they were very influential internationally. Activists from Matzpen, they traveled throughout Europe and the United States, and they really helped the international left understand Zionism, but also the contradictions inside Israeli society. And I think that the most important part of the legacy of Matzpen is how they would work together with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and especially with left-wing Palestinian groups like the DFLP. And they would work to build alliances between the Palestinian Liberation Movement and oppressed people in Israel. And I think in certain ways they were successful. We think of this as this eternal conflict, irreconcilable, Palestinians and Jews, in eternal battle against each other. And yet, partly because of the work of Matzpen and the work of an anti-war movement in Israel, there was a lot of mutual understanding. Oh, and before I forget, I just want to mention that there is this spectacular documentary about Matzpen. It was published about 20 years ago by an Israeli filmmaker. Unfortunately, I'd say, most of the protagonists of Matzpen are no longer around. The last couple of years, a number of them have passed away. But in this documentary, you see almost all of them. They're still reflecting about their experiences there. And it's just a very inspiring documentary. It's also interesting, the reason that you can see it for free on YouTube. I heard the filmmaker speaking about this and said it was almost impossible to get it onto Israeli public TV. Nobody wanted to put it out there. And so, nobody ended up buying the rights to it. So he just put it on.
Yeah, thank you for that recommendation. That sounds super interesting. I will definitely link to that Matzpen documentary in the show notes for others who are interested, and I will also for sure be watching it. This, I think, brings us up to the present day in this discussion. In my interview with Mariam Alanis for the last podcast episode, we talked a lot about the current context in Israel. So we talked about things like the Netanyahu regime's crises, the protests over the judicial reforms, things like that. I wanted to ask you about the current context in terms of the left in Israel. So what groups exist today and how would we characterize them? Or more specifically, are there still socialist anti-Zionist groups in Israel today?
Yes and no. So there's definitely a very progressive and incredibly brave left that exists in Israel. Last year, you had these enormous protests against the right-wing government of Netanyahu, and sometimes millions of people going out into the streets. And as we've written in Left Voice, this movement had a very contradictory character because people were talking about democracy and they wanted democratic rights, but only for Jews. Kind of expressing the eternal contradiction of Zionism. You can't have a Jewish democratic state. It's either going to be based on Jewish supremacy or it's going to be based on democracy, but you simply can't have both. In these protests, there was always an anti-apartheid bloc, sometimes several hundred, sometimes even several thousand people who were talking about democratic rights for Palestinians as well, saying that the only way to ensure democracy in Israel would be to have democracy available for everyone. And that's something these activists have faced terrible repression. They get attacked by police. And now in the context of the war, it's terrible. People will say, Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at the laws being passed right now, it's being banned not just to express opinions in favor of the rights of Palestinians, but even reading information about that is now being criminalized. And so our complete solidarity has to go to the Israeli anti-war movement, the people who are opposing this genocidal assault by their government. But when we look at the left, like more specifically, when we look at different strategies and political programs, I think we have to be clear that there is a huge problem that a big sector of the Israeli left have capitulated to this imperialist farce that is called the two-state solution. The idea that you can defend Zionist colonization, but somehow still guarantee the rights of Palestinians. What this means in practice is, we saw the Oslo Accords, we saw these discussion processes, and the concrete proposals by imperialist governments is, maybe Palestinians can use a quarter or a fifth of their country, and also all the Palestinian refugees and their descendants can't come back, they'll be expelled forever. That's what two-state solution means. And unfortunately, a lot of the left in Israel capitulated to this cynical idea. So this includes Maki, the Communist Party, who again are deserve our support for opposing the war, for coming out against this far-right government. One representative of Maki in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, has been expelled. And also we see groups that claim the Trotskyist tradition of their own. So probably the most important one today in Israel right now is Mavak, the socialist struggle movement. They come from the tradition of Ted Grant, of the Committee for Workers International. And they also support the idea of a two-state solution. They say they should be two different socialist states. And we've often debated with this idea that it seems kind of ridiculous to talk about the mass revolutionary struggles that are necessary to dismantle the Zionist state, but also to topple all the corrupt pro-imperialist dictatorial regimes throughout the Middle East. This kind of revolutionary struggle, this can have no other effect but overcoming all the national differences that have been built up by imperialism over the last century or so. This kind of revolutionary struggle is what brings people together and makes coexistence possible. After this struggle, to say, okay, we're going to split up into ethnically homogenous niches again now, that there's really no basis in history for thinking that a revolutionary process would have that result. So I think groups like Maki and like Mavak, we can't really call them anti-Zionists. They do think there should be a majority Jewish state in historical Palestine, maybe with different borders, but they do believe in this principle of ethnic division in Palestine. So I think, like the way comrades from Matzpen described this decades ago, they would say these are non-Zionist groups or un-Zionist groups or a-Zionist groups, but not exactly anti-Zionists. And I think we from Left Voice, we've been trying to maintain this Trotskyist perspective of a single, democratic, secular, and socialist Palestine, which can only exist as a part of a socialist federation of the Middle East based on class struggle of workers of different nationalities fighting against all the different pro-imperialist governments there.
Yeah, that leads me really nicely into my final question for today to wrap up this conversation, which basically is kind of this idea of why this history is actually important. So, what we've discussed today is super interesting from a historical perspective. So, I think this is a really excellent episodes for the history heads, the history lovers in the podcast audience. Certainly, also really important history to understand in terms of like what resistance to anti-Zionism has looked like and understanding the historical role of the left. But obviously, we're not just talking about this because it's interesting or it's history is fun or whatever. We also want to talk about why understanding this history is important for understanding the present moment and specifically what we should be fighting for right now. So, my last question of the day really is, what are the lessons that we can draw from this history that we've been talking about today?
Well, I think the most important conclusion is we're in a time right now when right-wing imperialist governments all over the world are equating Judaism and Zionism. And they're saying that anyone who's opposed to Israel's genocidal war, the only possible explanation that someone could disagree with this genocidal war is they must be Jew haters. What's most offensive about this is that all these imperialist governments are guilty of horrific anti-Semitic crimes, not just historically, but right now. Anti-Semitism is just a fundamental part of capitalism. That's something that Jewish socialists have always emphasized. And this attempt to smear the left, and especially to smear immigrant communities as being the source of anti-Semitism, ultimately only serves to excuse the anti-Semitism that's coming from the very top of bourgeois society. I mean, the only problem that imperialist governments have with anti-Semitism is when a Palestinian teenager goes out onto the streets of Berlin or Paris or London wearing a Palestinian scarf. That's anti-Semitism. And this terrible defamatory campaign ultimately only serves to excuse the anti-Semitism of the big bourgeoisie. But yeah, we're seeing at the current moment these very inspiring mobilizations by Jewish people. I mean, here in Berlin, we've seen a number of demonstrations organized by Jewish groups, but of course, everyone's looking at the United States. We had the occupation of the Statue of Liberty and the occupation of the Capitol building by Jewish groups. And I think there's a lot of discussion among the Jewish community, like what kind of perspective to fight for. Historically, among Jewish people in the United States, you did have a kind of loose identification with Zionism, this feeling that you're Jewish, you're somehow connected to Israel. You go on birthright, not everybody, but some people, somehow it's your country. And that's definitely breaking down. We've got a new generation of Jewish people in the United States who don't know the old supposedly socialist Zionism of 50 years ago, collective farms and singing the Internationale in Hebrew. No, all they know is this far right Zionist project, which is openly ethno nationalist, racist. I mean, a lot of Jewish people in the United States, I think their main political identification is opposition to Donald Trump and his terrible racism. And they see that Donald Trump is hugely popular in Israel and is a huge supporter of Israel. And so why would they possibly identify with a colonial project like this? And so some sectors of older liberal Jews, you have kind of a nostalgia. Can we go back to the old Israel where we had ethnic cleansing, but we didn't like to talk about it? We would sign on to humanistic ideals. And no, there's no going back to that. Socialist Zionism has collapsed to almost nothing. The Israeli parliament has almost no representatives of the reformist left. The Israeli Labor Party, which founded the state and dominated the state for the first 2 decades, is, I think, down to 4 seats at the moment. And it's not coming back because this ethno-nationalist project that Israel always was just not ultimately compatible with a progressive ideology about social democratic internationalism. If you build a state based on exclusive rights for Jewish people, I think it's almost inevitable that you're going to have a constant growth of these kind of millenarian religious fundamentalist projects. If Jewish identity is the very basis of the state, well, of course, people are going to develop ever more extreme versions of Jewish identity. And so I think this history of Jewish anti-Zionism is so important to look at other models of the fight against anti-Semitism and other models of Jewish self-emancipation that have existed throughout history. This model of, some Jewish authors referred to it as a fight for red assimilation, that the way that Jews were finally going to be accepted in society, bourgeois society ultimately always denied Jewish people equal rights and complete acceptance. And red assimilation, the idea was that by toppling bourgeois society, by getting rid of the capitalist mode of production, Jews could finally maintain whatever identities they wanted while becoming full members, equal members of a socialist society. So if we look back throughout history, it's always been the working class, it's always been the organized workers' movement, it's always been revolutionary struggles that have protected Jewish life. Revolutionary movements have always been a bulwark against anti-Semitism. Going back to the French Revolution, every revolutionary struggle has always brought new rights for Jewish people. And the parallel is true as well, that every counter-revolutionary movement has always used anti-Semitism as a way to try to cement old hierarchies and the powers of privilege. And so, as Jewish socialists were explaining more than a century ago, Zionism has no possibility to end anti-Semitism. And in fact, if you look at some of the leaders of Zionism, they never had the goal to end anti-Semitism. Zionism doesn't really have an ideological legitimacy without the idea that anti-Semitism is something that's eternal, that's always going to exist. And so I think Zionism is ultimately a very dystopian ideology. It says that the best that Jewish people can hope for is to hide behind concrete walls and barbed wire and using tanks and nuclear weapons to protect themselves against a force that is eternally going to try to destroy them. And I think in contrast to that, socialism represents a very optimistic ideology that says that nation states are something that have only existed for a couple hundred years, and that there's something that we can destroy, and we can create a human community in which every single person has equal rights. Every single person works together with every other person in the entire world to benefit the common good of everybody. And I think Jewish people, but like all oppressed people, are going to benefit enormously for that. And because Jewish people throughout their history have suffered so much oppression, it's no wonder that Jewish people have always been at the front of the socialist movement. That's one of the tragedies of this current historical myth about Zionism, is that it tends to erase these inspiring histories of Jewish socialists who fought for universal emancipation. In the words of Rosa Luxemburg, weren't just fighting against the oppression of the Jews, but were fighting against the oppression of all people. At the current movement, you're seeing this big politicization of Jewish people, and I think a lot of these socialist traditions are going to get rediscovered.
Nathaniel, this has been an excellent conversation. Before you go, though, in addition to being a member and writer of Left Voice, and now in addition to having been a guest on this podcast, and I'm sure you will join us many times in the future, you are also a published author. I wanted to give you an opportunity to plug your work a little bit. Are there any books you want to talk about, any columns or anything like that for people who want to read more and find your work?
Well, I write quite a bit for Left Voice. I also write a biweekly political column about Berlin. It's published at the newspaper ND. It's called Red Flag. If you're from Berlin, I can dig into Berlin politics in English there. I've published two books. First one is the one I already mentioned, the biography of Martin Monath. That's Monath. It's published by Pluto Press, and it's this great story of a Jewish revolutionary organizing Nazi soldiers in occupied France. I've also more recently published a guidebook about Berlin. It's called Revolutionary Berlin, a walking guide.
Yeah, and if folks are in Berlin, they should definitely check out Revolutionary Berlin, which are your walking tours. I recently did one of those when I was visiting Berlin in the summer. I can highly recommend it. And yeah, Nathaniel, thank you so much. This has been awesome.